Takaichi. She's kind of an extraordinary woman. This is someone who has styled herself after Margaret Thatcher. She actually wears blue and wears pearls in homage to Margaret Thatcher. She's called Japan's Iron Lady. A tough cookie and somebody who for a long time has been on the hawkish end.
I mean, Zelensky can't accept what Trump has on offer. And Putin says what Trump has on offer is actually not enough.
Yeah. From the Vox Media Podcast Network, this is The Long Game. I'm Jake Sullivan.
And I'm John Feiner.
So, John, what's on the agenda today?
Well, we're going to revisit a topic we've covered a number of times and probably a topic we'll continue to come back to, which is the latest on Ukraine, on the battlefield, in the negotiating room. We'll also talk about a topic that you previewed a couple of weeks back, which is rising tension between China and Japan over Taiwan and how that affects U.S. approach and strategy in the Indo-Pacific.
And we're going to end with a red team, blue team segment on how the United States should answer the question, will the U.S. defend Taiwan if China attacks? The red team will say we should keep our policy of strategic ambiguity and not really answer the question. The blue team will say we should change our policy and say, yes, the U.S. will defend Taiwan. So get ready for that. But John, we actually got a holiday off for the first time in 4 years, which is pretty awesome. How was your Thanksgiving?
Hard to know what to do with your time, but good time with my family in Vermont, and a lot of catching up with old friends, turkey trot.
How'd you do in the turkey trot?
Not particularly well. Got a lot of work to do on that front, but it was at least good to get out there in 32-degree weather.
So I was down in Kill Devil Hills, North Carolina. My family got together and rented a giant house 1 block from where the Wright brothers took the first flight. And I have to say to our viewers and listeners, it is totally worth going to this Wright Brothers National Monument, although all of my nieces and nephews told me it should be the Wright Family National Monument because there was apparently a sister, Catherine, who was helpful to the Wright brothers. But in any event, high recommendation. It's a really remarkable and inspiring thing to see where the U.S. Led the world in creating powered, controlled flight.
Lost to history, and not surprised the Sullivans managed to build in some sort of historical, enlightening experience into their family holiday. So
yeah,
well
nerd
done.
Thanksgiving. So, okay. The big question at our Thanksgiving table was, what's your favorite Thanksgiving food?
My mom, who, as you know, we lost last year, used to make a pie called a pumpkin chiffon pie. It has a gingerbread crust. It's sort of a mousse texture, a lot of whipped cream on top. My sister reprised that this year, was quite nervous about how it would go, and she killed it. So so that was a crowd pleaser for us.
That's pretty awesome.
Yeah, good stuff.
Okay, but this raises, I think, a much more fundamental question, an existential question, which is in your career at the State Department and the White House, you traveled to a lot of countries. You had a lot of food experiences. So do you have a most favorite and least favorite food experience from, all the wining and dining you did with heads of state and kings and prime ministers around the world?
Yeah, it's funny. Both of us spent time at the State Department before this most recent stint at the White House. You travel quite a lot. I think we both covered on the order of more than 100 countries. My most memorable...
By the way, just... How many countries was that?
I think you had slightly more.
Okay.
We focused on higher priorities. You trying to build up the stats. It's just a different approach to the job. My most memorable meal on the plus and the minus side was in December of 2013. I was working for John Kerry, who was the Secretary of State. We were in the throes of negotiations between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and we had a dinner in Ramallah with Abu Mazen, President Abbas of the Palestinian Authority. And you know how these meals are, in particular in the Arab world, just incredibly elaborate course after course of tabbouleh and hummus and kibbeh and kanafa for dessert. And we were sitting there going through this meal, and all of a sudden, one of the diplomatic security agents who travels with the Secretary of State, and there's a team of them, walks in and hands me a note that says, there is a ferocious snowstorm outside, and if we don't leave soon, I'm worried we're going to get stuck in Ramallah. Kind of goes without saying, but I'll say it just for the purposes of the story, that it's pretty unusual to get a big snowstorm in that part of the world. I'm from Vermont. John Kerry's from Boston. I handed him this note, and he sort of looked at me like, I'm in the middle of
is this a joke?
Very high stakes negotiation, and you're giving me something about the weather, like, let me get back to work. John Kerry has a big appetite for food, big appetite for negotiation. So time goes on. The guy from the Diplomatic Security Corps comes back in 2 or 3 times to hand me increasingly urgent notes. Finally, he, I think, realizing that we were basically giving him the stiff arm, I think went and stood outside for about 10 minutes and then came in literally covered in snow, all over his hair, like an inch of snow on his shoulders, just to kind of make the point. And hands me a note that says, basically, if we don't leave soon, I am worried we are not going to be able to get from Ramallah back to Jerusalem, where our hotel is. So I tell John Kerry, look, we kind of have to wrap this up or you might need to sleep like literally in your car. We don't have a hotel booked in Ramallah. You have a team of 50 or 60 people who are here. I don't think we're going to be able to get one last minute. So he grudgingly wraps up the negotiation. We rush out the door. And then what should have been like a 30-minute drive from Ramallah to Jerusalem took us probably close to 2 hours with a snowplow driving in front of the Secretary of State's motorcade. They got almost 2 feet of snow.
In Ramallah?
In Ramallah and Jerusalem, in that storm, which was the biggest storm they had had in like 20 or 30 years.
Holy cow.
Wild stuff.
That's a solid story about a dinner. It's not a great story about food.
The food was de-emphasized for the drama associated with the weather.
Okay, fair enough. So I'm going to stick with the prompt I provided of most and least favorite food experience abroad. And it's actually the same experience. We were in Baku, Azerbaijan. I was also at the State Department working for Secretary Clinton. We were meeting with the president of Azerbaijan, and they bring out these massive bowls full of very high-end caviar. And I've never had caviar before in my life. And
Minnesota, growing up?
Was not a common thing. I probably ate some fish eggs, like walleye fish eggs or something.
Down at the pond.
Not this kind of high-end, Caspian Sea sturgeon or whatever it is they're serving over there in Azerbaijan. So heaping bowls of this stuff. And I wasn't sure exactly how to eat it, but I was like, hey, this is cool. This is like first time eating caviar, sitting here down the table from Hillary Clinton. Wow, this is cool. So I took a giant bite, and I do not like caviar. It turns out I almost spit this out. Meanwhile, everyone else on our side of the table is just like gulping the stuff down. It's like the greatest thing they've ever had. So that made a definite, very real impression on me. And we began tracking at that point which countries serve better food, which countries serve worse food. I'll tell you the country that serves the worst food, it's the United States of America. Not because we don't have amazing food, but because we have terrible hospitality.
We are the worst hosts. We often don't even have bottles of water to give people who come and visit. And sometimes these meetings can last 2-3 hours. You can tell people are starting to wonder, like, do we not like them? Are we trying to kind of, make them sweat in the conversation by not giving them food or anything to drink? And another weird idiosyncrasy of all this, when we meet with counterparts, if we wanted to provide food,
often pay for it.
We had to buy it ourselves, like literally walk down to the White House mess, put it on our account, bring it up and serve it to people. It's a humbling experience because we're treated much better when we go overseas.
But it's not just when we're trying to provide some basic coffee service to our counterparts who come in to visit. When the president of the United States wants to host one of his counterparts, food becomes a super complicated piece of the equation. I remember during COVID when we were hosting an allied prime minister and the COVID rules were very much in force. And the notion was these guys can't take down their masks. But the country in question was saying to us, a meal is central to the idea that this is a serious visit. Without a meal, it's like you didn't really host us. So we had weeks of negotiations back and forth on this and ultimately settled on hamburgers in front of the president and the prime minister with full masks and each of them like 8 feet apart. And they never got to touch their hamburger. I wonder if those hamburgers ever got eaten by anybody. But it was just a bizarre moment. And then from that point on, the fight over food, whether it was, we'll have little finger sandwiches on the table just so it looks like a meal, even if it really isn't one. There were times when I thought we should go get some little kids like toy food and stick it on the table. Because for other countries, the idea that they're getting hosted for a meal at the White House is absolutely critical. And yet for the United States, we're kind of like, too big a pain.
Food for the photo, but not to eat is like peak American diplomacy.
Yeah, exactly. You can look at that, and we'll take a picture of it, but you can't touch it.
Exactly. All right. Should we go from the fat to the fryer, or whatever the expression is, and actually talk about the topics on the agenda?
Let's do it.
So last week, we obviously didn't record, as we said, because of Thanksgiving. There was some news, though, last week, and I think in some ways the biggest news that came out of Washington, at least, is this development involving U.S. military strike against a boat in the Caribbean. We've talked about this topic before. But in this case, it was actually followed by a second strike when the operators involved identified that the ship had been wrecked but not sunk, and that there were actually a couple of survivors floating in the water, either hanging onto debris or next to the ship. They took another strike, destroying the ship and killing the survivors, which has generated a ferocious amount of debate on the legality of that, on the morality of that, on the policy wisdom of that. I don't know if you want to offer a few thoughts, but this is something that we're going to have to come back to, I think, probably as soon as next week.
Yeah, I think basically we should set aside a segment next week to go through this. And frankly, taking another week fits with the idea that we're not just doing hot takes because there is an ongoing investigation here. We're taping here on a Wednesday. This podcast will drop Friday. That we're going to hear from the admiral involved, Mitch Bradley, at some point. Both Democrats and Republicans on the Hill are digging into this, so we may have more developments to fully understand exactly what happened. But what seems to be clear is, one, there are real questions as to whether this was an order to strike defenseless people, which would raise real questions about war crimes. And two, the Secretary of Defense, of War, of whatever we're calling him, Pete Hegseth, kind of went out of his way to throw the uniformed military under the bus in a quite ostentatious and transparent tweet. And so the question of civil-military relations going forward and whether there's been a breach of trust, that's something we are also going to have to take a hard look at because that has implications far beyond just this strike.
Yeah, and look, unlike many of the scandals or alleged scandals in the Trump administration, this one has a lot of attention from Republicans in Congress as well, which means it's probably not going to go away soon. So we'll be back to it.
Yeah. And so to our listeners, to our viewers, we're going to really dig into this in a way that's not so much about playing gotcha or who said what when, but rather that really tries to look at the larger implications of it and what it means for the U.S. national security enterprise going forward.
Right. So Ukraine. We've talked about Ukraine a number of times before. Obviously, this is in some ways the biggest issue in the world, this ongoing war. But since we last recorded, there have been a number of developments, I think, that are worth just laying out and giving people a sense, I think, of where this all stands. So we've had the production of a 28-point peace plan. A lot of debate about what the origin of that plan was. Was it translated through Google Translate from the original Russian and then handed to the Ukrainians, given how slanted a lot of people thought it was in the direction of Russia, full of concessions Ukraine would have to make? Then a U.S. delegation actually went to Kyiv to talk to the Ukrainians about that plan. They did not exactly meet with a ton of success or support. The Ukrainians, I think, basically told them, not going to work for us. Then Ukraine, maybe working with the Europeans, produced a different plan, shorter, 19, 20 points, something along those lines, that was much more balanced, much more favorable to Ukraine. The Ukrainians then negotiated with the Trump team in Florida this past week. And then Steve Witkoff, President Trump's kind of envoy for everything, and Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law, went off to Moscow to see President Putin and your old friend, Yuri Ushakov. Where do you think this all leaves us at this point? Are we like on the cusp of greatness and a peace deal?
First of all, I'm going to put a pin in the your old friend Yuri Ushakov thing. We can talk about that. By the way, Yuri Ushakov, for those who don't know, is sort of the counterpart to the U.S. National Security Advisor. He's the foreign policy advisor to President Putin. They also have a national security advisor who's quite a character, or was quite a character in his own right. Now it's a new, different character. I seem to outlast a lot of these different guys. So look, it's interesting because there's been all of this back and forth. And again, sitting here on a Wednesday, the night after President Putin hosted Witkoff and Kushner for 5 hours, and seemingly that meeting broke up without a clear path forward to a negotiated solution here. You know, when I think about this from the perspective of Zelensky, he's really fighting right now on three fronts. There's the actual front, the battlefield, which we should just spend a minute on. There's the home front, and that's a battle over corruption. and the accusations that he has faced. And he actually had to take the extraordinary step of getting rid of his closest confidant, his chief of staff, Andrei Yermak, someone who we also both
Another
know
sort
very
of former
well,
counterpart of yours.
we should talk about. And then the third is call it the diplomatic front, where he's trying to fend off the imposition of a bad peace by President Trump and his team. So this is a guy fighting on multiple sides, trying to just keep moving things forward for his country. What do you think? Where do we go from here?
Well, I mean, the Trump administration, I guess somewhat understandably, does feel like there's opportunity in this crisis for Zelensky, as you just laid out, that maybe because he's a bit damaged by this corruption scandal, maybe because things are not going that well on the battlefield. Again, at least according to the Trump administration. I have to say, you and I both talked to plenty of people who are still involved in this conflict, and the read I get is that the story is not great for Ukraine on the battlefield. They are slowly losing territory. But that phrase, slowly losing territory, you could have applied basically to the last 2 years of the war. And there is nothing I see and nothing I have heard that suggests any sort of imminent collapse of the Ukrainian front lines. We don't know what we don't know anymore. But part of the squeeze play that the Trump administration seems to be trying to run is convince the Ukrainians, look, you've got a real problem with this corruption scandal. You are losing on the battlefield. And if you don't make peace soon, you might lose. And implicitly, you might lose more support from us. So you've got to take a deal that's unpalatable to you. But Zelensky, I think for very understandable reasons, is not going to take a deal that his public will not accept and will not support. And so that seems to be the situation that they're in. For him to make a deal, he would have to give up a whole bunch of territory that Ukraine currently controls and that Russia cannot take militarily. He doesn't seem ready to do that. By the way, Putin doesn't seem ready to take this deal either.
Well, I want to come on to Putin in a second, but just to stick on this point on the battlefield for a minute, I agree with you that the situation has not dramatically changed. Ukraine is having to cede ground very slowly, but Russia is having a devil of a time making substantial progress on the battlefield. Even though Putin has gone out and said we've captured this city of Pokrovsk, it's going to take them a long time to get the rest of Donetsk. But somehow, as you said, the Trump administration keeps saying Ukraine's on the brink of some catastrophic military defeat. Do you think they really believe that? Or is this gamesmanship to try to force a deal? Or at the senior levels, do they just have a different view of what's likely to happen on the battlefield?
Look, I think battlefield analysis is notoriously, I would say, not great, to be honest. I mean, we got all kinds of reads at different points from experts in our system. I mean, we gave our own reads sometimes, but predicting where a conflict is going to go is not something I think anybody's particularly good at. It just doesn't feel any different to me today than it did a year ago in terms of kind of how Ukraine is able to fend off Russian onslaught. And so what you have is both sides almost not wanting to say no to Trump, but not able to say yes to Trump. So you read the public comments, and none of them are like flat rejection. None of them are, flipping over the table and walking away, but none of them are saying yes either at this point.
Right. It's all, that looks very interesting. There's some stuff we can work with.
I like some of this. I really don't like some of this.
And that was the Russian readout of the meeting in Moscow this week. Some things we liked, some things we totally reject. And at the end of it, I felt the Russian body language was, we're not there, we're not close, we want to keep fighting. And in a way, what Putin is signaling is either give me everything I want, or I'm going to go take it, and I'm just as happy going to take it as you giving it to me. Because I think there's an argument that Putin would prefer just have the war go on. He doesn't want to have to reabsorb 1 million troops back into his country. And he doesn't want to give Ukraine peace of any kind. He wants to keep pummeling Ukraine so that it can never really truly feel safe, secure, and able to build this consolidated democracy that would be a real counterpoint to what Putin has built in Russia. So it just looks like he keeps making his position a little bit more than what the other side could give so that the war goes on. Is that a fair read? Yeah.
I mean, Zelensky can't accept what Trump has on offer. And Putin says what Trump has on offer is actually not enough for him. So the Venn diagram is basically zero. Zelensky also, you do get the sense that both sides are almost inserting these poison pills into their demands. So Putin says, not only am I not going to settle for the amount of territory that Trump's offering me, I want more. Zelensky has said now, backed by some European officials, that the agreement should also have some measure of accountability on the Russian side for the war crimes that they've committed. In other words, Russia will have to agree to submit to some kind of international tribunal or justice for what it has done in Ukraine. And the odds of Russia agreeing to that do not seem high to me.
So I think we should spend a minute on this home front issue for Zelensky, because when we last talked about this, the pressure was really building on him. There was an outrageous set of revelations around a kickback scheme to the tune of $100 million or more of money that was supposed to go to protect energy sites from Russian strikes that was just ending up in Ukrainian officials' pockets. So that pressure built, and Zelensky ultimately made the decision to get rid of Andriy Yermak, his chief of staff, his close confidant, someone I talk to very frequently, someone you talk to a fair amount. Andriy is a big guy physically. He is a big personality. He is somebody who has very strong views, could be very stubborn, and over time worked to basically consolidate power in the office of the presidency, so that, as an analogy, it would be roughly the equivalent, in my view, of the president of the United States kind of getting rid of his vice president, like saying, J.D. Vance, you're gone. But a highly empowered J.D. Vance is gone. And also getting rid of a very close friend, someone who was with him before he became president.
His producer, I think, when he was a television
guy who
star.
was a lawyer, an entertainment lawyer, basically working with Zelensky, who was an actor at the time. And by the way, this is just an aside, but I think it's worth saying. One of the things that I think is underappreciated is both Zelensky and Yermak were really mastering English as this war was going on. So not only did they have to defend their country and make really hard calls and, worry about being killed, but to conduct diplomacy globally, they had to improve a language that they spoke to a limited extent before the war started and now speak much, much better. But I remember the first few times I talked to Yermak, it was very difficult to communicate with him. In fact, sometimes we do it through interpreters.
But not always.
A few, exactly, which could be painful.
Its own problem.
But years later, these guys can both speak pretty good English. It just is kind of the human element of this, that on top of every other pressure piled on top of these guys, they had to deal with this. So with Yermak, he's gone off to the front lines and has actually put out photos of him going out to the front lines. I think it has alleviated a fair amount of the pressure on Zelensky. I think people saw that as a very serious move. Yermak had his home raided, but of course we don't know yet what, if anything, comes of that. And I just have to say, on a personal basis, having dealt with him, it could be frustrating, but also to move things forward, to try to solve problems in the war, in the defense of Ukraine, Yermak was a key player. And his removal raises a question about who's going to fill that role as we go forward. And, that's something that I'm very closely watching, because who steps in to help run the Ukrainian operation under Zelensky is going to be critical.
Yeah, look, as you say, there's sort of two kinds of power in the government. There's formal power, which obviously President Zelensky has in spades, maybe ministers in their government have in spades. And then there's sort of derivative power, basically the power of the presidency imbued in this person, in this case, Andriy Yermak, who could operate almost as Zelensky's proxy everywhere he went, because everybody knew how close they were. And he had just a ton of this derivative power, and that made him the kind of indispensable counterpart for every other government in the world. That also put him in the crosshairs internally in Ukraine. I mean, we've been hearing allegations, rumors, charges that either he was corrupt or that he was sort of abusing his authority going back quite some time. The knives had been out for him. And he finally now has moved on to other things, as you say, possibly going to the front lines to fight. At least that's what he says, and that's what the photographs suggest. So a major, major move, taking the air out of the balloon in this scandal, but maybe not the end of it. Rumors are there are going to be other shoes to drop, other people who will be implicated, including people in his inner circle. So this is something we're going to have to watch.
One more point I would make. I talked to Andriy the night the war kicked off, as Russian planes were in the air and Russian tanks were rolling on the ground. And in that conversation, President Biden then spoke with President Zelensky shortly thereafter. I actually wasn't sure, was I ever going to speak with him again? Was there is this sense now so deep into the war that I think when you step back, we lose sight a bit of what happened at the beginning and how touch and go this whole thing was. And how in a different world, Russia rolls into Kyiv and Ukraine ceases to exist. And instead of that, Ukraine stands, Kyiv stands, and will stand no matter what happens. And for that, Yermak and Zelensky and all those other guys who stood tall that day, I think they do deserve a great deal of credit. When in other parts of the world, in other conflicts, people didn't stand tall. And their capitals fell.
Yeah, these are historic figures. And I think we will always remember that night sitting in your office as the war was starting, the president talking to President Zelensky on the phone, and Zelensky saying something along the lines of, I don't remember the exact quote, but basically, I'm not sure when we'll be able to speak again. And I think all he meant was, I'm going to be busy
and
managing this war.
Or they'll cut the lines.
Yeah, right. Anything like that. Yeah. But the other kind of implicit
deep import
message there was like, we weren't sure if he was going to make it at that point, and probably he wasn't sure either. So it's a good reminder. I will say it also kind of underscores the challenge of peacemaking for the Trump administration, which is when a country is very strong and feeling like they have the upper hand on the battlefield, they are very disinclined sometimes to make peace because they want to press the advantage and like win a military victory. When a country is on the back foot, as maybe arguably Ukraine is right now, because of this corruption scandal, because of these mounting, even if they're small, losses on the battlefield, they're also disinclined to want to make peace because they feel like they can't get the terms that they need. They don't have the strength at the negotiating table. It's a bit of a paradox because how do you ever get to peace if that's the line of thinking? And that's the challenge the Trump administration is going to have to work through if they want to make a deal.
So just to bring this home, a huge amount of diplomatic activity over the last 2 weeks, meetings in Kyiv, meetings in Miami, meetings in Moscow. Where are we? Are we any further down the track? Are we basically where we've always been? Is the war just going on? What's your read?
It's the story of this issue that I suspect if and when we decide to talk about this next week or the week after, it's going to be a version of this same conversation. My take is we have not reached yet an inflection point in the conflict.
And maybe part of the answer to the question of when do you get out of that paradox you just described is just both sides are exhausted.
Yeah.
And maybe we're just not there yet.
Which is how many wars end.
All right. Moving on to a different part of the world, the Asia-Pacific, or as Kirk Campbell would tell us, we have to say the Indo-Pacific. So we've had a set of developments over the course of the past month that you and I have both been following closely. They haven't really been front page news in the United States, but I think they are of real strategic significance. A new Japanese prime minister comes in and is basically asked a question about what would happen if China invaded Taiwan. And she made a comment, I want to get it right. She said, no matter how you think about it, it could constitute a survival-threatening situation. And those words were important, survival-threatening situation, because Japan has had a historic principle, basically since World War II, of a form of pacifism. It would fight in self-defense, but it wouldn't go attacking any other countries. And a survival-threatening situation raises the specter, this would be the self-defense of Japan to go defend Taiwan. So from Beijing's ears, that sounds like the Japanese prime minister saying, we will go defend Taiwan, which is a dramatic departure from Japan's traditional policy, both on its own military approach, but specifically on how it deals with the Taiwan question. So China kind of reacted to that whole thing.
Kind of.
What do you think?
Well, I mean, the Chinese reaction is very interesting to me because they had options here. They could have essentially ignored the comment. By the way, it is worth pointing out one word that she did use that is quite important here, and that's the word could, not would. She did not say it would necessarily represent such an event. She said it could. And that preserves a concept we'll get to arguably a bit later, which is the idea that Japan's response to a situation like that is still ambiguous. She did not definitively say that Japan would intervene militarily, but she leaned pretty far into it, which gave China the option. Either you kind of brush it off, maybe issue a statement saying you don't like it, or you do what they did, which is kind of dial it up to maybe not 10 out of 10, but I'd say probably something on the order of 8 or 9 out of 10, at least in terms of their initial reaction. So what do the Chinese decide to do? One, they tell their citizens, don't go to Japan. Tourists should not go to Japan. We're not sure you're going to be treated well. We're not sure you're going to be
turn the cruise
safe.
ships around.
Yeah.
Or even worse, send them to Korea just to stick in the knife.
Exactly. Second, they cut off seafood imports from Japan to China, which is a step they've taken in the past to try to retaliate against the Japanese. Big, significant development in
By the way,
Japan's
that's
economy.
a strange one for me, always has been. It's like the Chinese are saying to the Japanese, we will not eat your delicious sushi.
Because you said something we don't like.
It's a little bit like the sheriff in Blazing Saddles holding a gun to his head and saying, don't move or I'll shoot. Like, why would you not want Japanese seafood?
I suspect there are other markets for that Japanese seafood too, but leaving that aside, then there's the rhetoric, which I just think we should read also in full because it came from a strange place and it's quite heated. So the Chinese consul general in the city of Osaka, Japan. Now, why they chose that official, I'm not sure. He's been there for quite some time and actually has made some pretty provocative comments in the past.
It's right down the road from where Abe was shot.
Exactly.
So there is a freighted weight to that guy.
Takaichi is Abe's protege. So maybe that's part of why this person was chosen. But
so what did he say?
What he said was, that filthy neck that barged in on its own, I've got no choice to cut it off without a moment's hesitation. Are you prepared for that? Which is a bit of an awkward phrasing.
It's funny, I have a slightly different
It's probably maybe the translation is
I have
different.
dirty neck.
Oh, filthy or dirty. That's the major diplomatic difference there.
Yeah, but dirty or filthy, either way.
But basically implying that he was going to either personally or nationally decapitate the new
we have no choice but to cut it off.
Leader of Japan. Now, he deleted that. I think it was a tweet or something. But quite a strong reaction from the Chinese. And now no evidence that either side is likely to back down.
Well, for one thing, this Japanese prime minister, Takaichi, is now more popular than any prime minister has been in a very long time. So while this week she has also reaffirmed Japan's traditional policy on Taiwan, she certainly has not retracted that statement. And we should just pause for a moment on Takaichi because she's kind of an extraordinary woman. This is someone who has styled herself after Margaret Thatcher. She actually wears blue and wears pearls in homage to Margaret Thatcher. She's called Japan's Iron Lady. So one could say a tough cookie and somebody who for a long time has been on the hawkish end, has been willing to be blunt and tough. And so I expect, we'll see more of this style as she goes forward. Now, of course, President Trump gets in the middle of this. And I think it's worth spending a minute kind of talking through the choreography around Xi, Trump, and Takaichi and what that kind of says about where this relationship, the alliance between the U.S. and Japan, the relationship between the U.S. and China, and the relationship between Japan and China are going forward. So talk to us about what happened.
Maybe just a couple context points here that I think are interesting. One is there have been these spats between the Japanese and the Chinese before. I think we've talked about them previously. I'm not sure there's been one as high profile as this that is actually about Taiwan. That is a pretty significant difference. Japan is only about 70 miles Japanese territory from Taiwan, so closer than the United States is to Cuba. And I think the other important context point here is that, as you kind of alluded to earlier, Japan in the post-World War II era has had what is sometimes described as a pacifist constitution, a pacifist approach to its national defense, which means it will not use its military outside of its own territory, will not use its military for offensive purposes. But they have made some significant revisions to that approach, to that constitution in recent years, in large part in response to what has been a massive military buildup from China and the perceived threat that that would pose to Japan. We worked on a number of aspects of this, including some of the constitutional changes that Japan made, including some arrangements where the United States and Japan could actually start producing certain weapon systems together. So Japan is kind of feeling, I would say, a bit more assertive in its foreign policy in response to, I think, this perceived threat from China. And one of the areas where the rubber could potentially meet the road, as this instance suggests, is over Taiwan. We quietly talked to the Japanese quite a lot about Taiwan during the course of our administration. It is not an issue that the Japanese usually talk about in such an elaborate way publicly. But because her comments were, yes, about the possibility of a conflict or at least military action against China, but also about the possibility that the United States could be drawn in to a contingency in which China takes military action against Taiwan, Trump almost had to weigh in and say something. But he did a pretty unconventional thing, I think, both in terms of choreography and in terms of substance. I don't know.
Well, first, it took the U.S. State Department, I think, a week to actually put out a statement saying, hey, we have Japan's back.
I think the ambassador
Hey,
said something earlier, but the State Department took a long time, and the White House didn't say anything, I think, until Trump made the call.
After this series of actions and statements from China, including we're going to cut off the neck of the prime minister, and including a number of these economic countermeasures, that'd be a time you would expect an ally like the United States to step up and have the back of Japan and of this prime minister. That didn't really happen in any kind of significant way for quite some time. And as you say, the White House really never weighed in until there was a call between President Trump and the prime minister. I'm sorry, no, that didn't happen. A call between President Trump and President Xi, where at first...
So his first call on this topic, not to the Japanese to the prime minister.
Right, exactly. Is not to the Japanese prime minister, it's to China. Now, at first, the reporting was that the Chinese requested the call, which would be highly unusual. I think we talked in one of our earlier episodes.
That basically never happens.
They never request calls. Then I think it has since come out, although I'm still not entirely clear on this, that it was in fact Trump requesting the call. They have the call. President Xi gives a long stem winder about Taiwan, his perspective that it is part of China. This is outrageous what Japan did in his view, and that it is President Trump's responsibility to tell the Japanese prime minister basically to stop stirring up trouble. Here President Trump wants to talk about a bunch of other things, probably is not that keen to go deep on this issue, but basically you have Xi saying Washington and Beijing were the two big responsible players. These other little troublemakers, we together have to manage them. So go manage your little troublemaker.
So you should talk about the call that happened after that call. But one other just point of recent background, which is President Trump obviously saw President Xi recently. And in the readout of that meeting, it was emphasized sort of by both sides that Taiwan did not feature prominently in that conversation. Now, that also is very unusual. I mean, this is a major topic in U.S.-China relations. Impossible for me to imagine a conversation between President Biden and President Xi in which Taiwan did not come up at all, unless it was like a 5-minute encounter in a hallway somewhere. So that was pretty surprising. And then all of a sudden, this issue is like front and center and a bit of a mini crisis, at least in the region. And so Trump finally has to engage it with Xi.
And then having listened to a lecture from President Xi saying, go get your troublemaker in line, President Trump actually calls the prime minister. And, there are varying readouts of what exactly happened in the call, but it does seem he didn't push her to retract, but he did say, hey, please don't provoke China. So sort of followed through on what...
Turn the volume down was one of the, at least paraphrasals of what his message was to Takaichi.
Right. And consistent, essentially, with what President Xi asked of him. Now, if we had been advising President Biden on this situation, if it had unfolded in this way, the choreography would have looked quite different. It would have been an immediate call to the Japanese prime minister, a coordinated readout, basically saying that the United States and Japan are standing together. We're standing in support of peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait, and that we reject any efforts at coercion or intimidation by the other side, or some version of that. and then an engagement with China to try to lower the temperature, but coordination with ally first, then engagement with China. Here you have it in the reverse. And I think this is telling about how President Trump sees the region and really sees the world. There are the big countries and there's everybody else, and you go, your main dealings are the big countries, and then the derivative dealings are with everybody else. And I think that is ultimately not going to serve U.S. national interests well, and is going to teach Beijing that they can keep coming to Washington to try to advance their policy objectives through how America deals with its allies and friends. I think this is not a good development.
No, it's a bad moment. And it also gives a sense of President Trump's priorities, I think, not sort of standing firm with your allies, which, by the way, is not, again, American charity. It actually makes America stronger, given that we're the only country in the world that has this global network of alliances. Not that, but actually probably he was worried on some level that this was going to scuttle what has been a longstanding desire from him to cut this big deal with China. They just reached a bit of a truce on their trade disputes when they met in the conversation that we discussed. He's got a number of meetings likely lined up next year with President Xi, including a visit to Beijing, including possibly a meeting in Washington. And I don't think he wants this other irritant, which he sees as somehow not about the United States, to get in the way of that effort to cut this big deal. And so he sent that message kind of unmistakably by starting with Xi and then turning the volume down, or trying to turn the volume down on Takaichi's comments. What are you going to be looking for in terms of where this goes from here?
Well, first, as I mentioned, Takaichi was speaking in the Japanese parliament, the Diet, and basically said, I reaffirm Japan's longstanding position. Didn't retract what she said, but said, I reaffirm Japan's longstanding position, which is what I call pulling a Biden. Because, of course, President Biden 4 times when directly asked, would you defend Taiwan, said, yes, I would, but then said later after each time, our policy has not changed. Therefore, preserving the policy, but also making the statement, and Takaichi has done something similar. Will that be enough now for China to basically back off? I think it's possible, because I think they believe they have won a strategic victory here by shifting how the U.S. engages in the region in the way you and I just talked about. So what I'm going to be watching for as we go forward is, what lesson does Beijing take, and how far do they think they can push the envelope on the Taiwan question with Donald Trump? And I think that is a big and open question that I am confident we will be revisiting on here in many episodes to come.
Yeah, look, and if they decide they're going to push it further, I guess the kinds of steps they could take are maybe more trade restrictions of some kind, more economic steps, and also the possibility of more military pressure of some kind. Obviously, the sort of hot spot part of the Japan-China relationship are the Senkaku Islands, which Japan administers. The U.S. takes no position on the ultimate sovereignty of, but recognizes—
I would say obvious to you, maybe not obvious to everybody.
To the whole world.
So you might take, a beat on the Senkaku Islands.
Yeah, so the Senkaku Islands in the East China Sea.
Bunch of rocks.
Let's just say not heavily inhabited, but that is a matter of major dispute between Japan and the PRC.
They both claim them as their territory.
Both claim them as their territory.
But Japan actually administers.
As we say, administers, which basically means they drive their ships around them and assert some degree of control, but maybe not formal sovereignty. The U.S. position is for the countries to work out ultimately, but what we recognize Japan's administration of these islands, and I think quite importantly, we recognize that our mutual defense treaty with Japan applies to this territory, even if the ultimate sovereignty is in dispute. Is that basically right?
It's basically right. I'm glad you asked the question, is that basically right? Because it's a strange thing that we do not take a position on the sovereignty of these islands, whether they belong to Japan or China. Taiwan also claims them, by the way.
Yeah.
But we do say we would use force to defend them if China tried to physically eject Japan from the islands. It's a strange situation, but that is the situation. And you know what? While it's strange, I think it's stabilizing, because I do believe it has kept a lid on the temperature rising too high over these islands. But, that doesn't mean that will be true forever. And as you say, we should be watching to see if more Chinese warships, more Chinese assets start swarming these islands and create a bit of a crisis there. I think we're more likely headed to a downward slope on the escalation, but maybe not. Let's see.
And whether the United States continues to clearly and unambiguously remind the world, really remind the Chinese that our mutual defense treaty does apply to this and that we would use force if it came to it. That is, I think, what the Japanese will be looking for if this escalates. So.
Okay, so this is actually a very good segue to our red team, blue team exercise, because speaking of strange but stabilizing formulas, because the U.S. position for a long time, when a U.S. official has asked the question, would the U.S. use force to defend Taiwan if China attacked Taiwan, has been to avoid answering it. Basically to say, we're going to do everything we can to make sure that doesn't happen. Some people call this strategic ambiguity. So we don't say yes and we don't say no. And that we see as consistent with both the one China policy, which itself is a kind of strange thing, and with a law called the Taiwan Relations Act, where we say that we are going to provide defense articles to Taiwan for their self-defense, and we are going to maintain capacity in the region to resist coercion against Taiwan. But in the TRA, it does not specifically say, the Taiwan Relations Act does not specifically say the U.S. is committed to use force to come to Taiwan's defense. So that has been the case for decades. And the question is, in 2025, should we change that policy, junk strategic ambiguity, and make a definitive proclamation, yes, we will come to Taiwan's defense if they are attacked. And you are going to take the yes, we should junk strategic ambiguity side of the argument, and I am going to take the status quo should stay side of the argument. So, or at least a version of the status quo.
Yeah. So before I get into the argument, I will say this is not a reason to dump it, but hey, this is a nightmare for politicians to try to navigate. I feel like you just explained that about as well and concisely as you could, and it's sort of all over the place.
By the way, I had to go back in prep for this episode, and I'm not even ashamed to say this because I dealt with this issue intimately day in, day out, just to make sure I had it right. It's like going back to a biblical passage. The one China policy, just as an example, is that we recognize the government in Beijing as the sole legal government of China, and we acknowledge that China says that Taiwan is part of China, but we do not accept that, and we take no position on the sovereignty question of Taiwan, and we also say that the issue has to be resolved by peaceful means without coercion by both sides. That is our one China policy, and I could have said a word wrong there, and we'd have to spend weeks. The earth could shake if I had done so as national security advisor. So you're right. It's an extremely
and for a president like Joe Biden,
policy,
who believes basically like, you ask me a direct question, I'm going to give you a direct answer, as you said 4 times. The idea of this kind of ambiguity is just massively uncomfortable.
Well, you remember going in to talk to him about this. You know, Mr. President, you're likely to get asked this question. Here's some gobbledygook that
here's
we're saying to you, and him looking at us like
the catechism.
We had 2 heads. Like, I'm going to give an answer in human English.
All right. So not the reason to drop it, but it's a very hard thing to get your mind around and to explain. In fact, the best thing it's got going for it, which you'll probably make as part of your argument, is that it seems to work for the time being. But why would we get rid of it? All right. So a few points on this. One, it's a very unusual policy if you're trying to establish deterrence, which is, I think, in large part what this policy is intended to do. Traditionally, deterrence, which is trying to make your adversary not do something you don't want them to do, thrives on clarity. So your adversary knows, if you do X, we will do Y, so they don't do X because they don't want you to do Y. A good example of that is mutually assured destruction during the Cold War, nuclear standoff. One country would not use nuclear weapons because they know the other country would use nuclear weapons, and nobody wants that outcome. But right now, it is not totally clear that China is deterred by strategic ambiguity. Their military activity around Taiwan, across what is called the median line between Taiwan and mainland China, is increasing. And so it is not clear that China is deterred by this. So that raises the question of whether the U.S. policy needs to do more. Second, this policy is designed, I think, for a kind of a different world where China was a lot weaker. It was a lot less aggressive, and the U.S. could sort of look askance at Beijing if it went too far or it did too much and sort of back them off. That is not true anymore. By all accounts, including public statements coming out of the PRC, China is preparing to be militarily ready for intervention in Taiwan by the year 2027. And by the way, they could be ready well before that, for all we know. That doesn't mean they've made a decision to do something militarily vis-a-vis Taiwan, but they want to be ready to do that. Now, look, this obviously can't be a bluff, but in this case, it wouldn't have to be. We don't have to say exactly what we would do if we were to come to Taiwan's defense, including if we were to come to Taiwan's defense militarily. There is a whole range of activities that would meet the mark in terms of providing U.S. military support to Taiwan in a contingency like that. And even the gold standard of U.S. security guarantees, NATO Article 5, which we talk about a lot in the context of not just the Ukraine war, but the possibility that Russia could attack NATO territory, does not require any particular response to fulfill the commitment that an attack on one is an attack on all. You still get to decide what you do, and that would be the case in a Taiwan contingency as well. Another reason, I think the risk of unintentional conflict between the U.S. and China, which we all are trying to avoid, would be a terrible outcome for the world and for both countries, actually is higher if China doesn't know what the U.S. will do if it takes action against Taiwan. Maybe China underestimates a U.S. response. Maybe because of some of the things that President Trump has said and some of the impressions that he has left, that he might not be that interested in defending Taiwan militarily. China might miscalculate, take military action, back the United States into a corner, and then we end up in a conflict that we all, through these policies, are trying to avoid. So I think ambiguity arguably increases the risk of superpower conflict. Another reason is time. If China moves on Taiwan, we are not going to have a lot of time as a nation, as a government, to decide our response. And if you are like walking into the president's office, walking into the Oval Office, walking into the Situation Room, and putting all the options on the table and asking for a decision about should we or shouldn't we, as opposed to deciding within the category of should we, what the different options are, it's going to take longer to generate a response. And this may be a fait accompli before we've even made a decision. I think that's a real risk. The argument that's often made, I suspect you'll make it, is that China would go absolutely nuts if the United States changed basically what is just a paper statement policy. We will defend Taiwan by force. But as you said earlier in this very segment, Joe Biden said that 4 times when asked a direct question, will the U.S. use military force to defend Taiwan? And 4 times he said, not hemming and hawing, he basically just said yes. Of course, yes, he added, our policy hasn't changed. But we got yelled at all the time about all kinds of things by the Chinese they didn't like that we did. Our export controls, various other things that we said. The 4 times that Joe Biden made these comments, the Chinese reaction was pretty muted, honestly. They did not dial it up to 8 or 9 out of 10 the way they did against the Japanese. And I think that is because they have basically priced in at this point that we are likely to intervene in some way militarily, which was all a change in policy would require. Last thing I'll say, we could do this with a degree of conditionality that I think would guard against the other risk of making this policy change. The other risk, obviously, is that you kind of give Taiwan enough of a shot in the arm that they feel like, well, we're going to go further with our statements and we're going to declare, independence from China, which U.S. policy has been not supportive of for quite some time. But I think you could very easily say we will defend Taiwan militarily if China acts unilaterally against Taiwan. But if Taiwan takes some provocative step that we don't support, like declaring independence, that's a different situation. You wouldn't necessarily have to say what you would do or you won't do in that situation, but you could make clear this commitment to defend Taiwan doesn't apply, essentially, if they pick and provoke the fight by taking some step that's inconsistent with U.S. policy. What do you think?
I think that that's a very strong, very well-articulated argument, but there are some tensions and inconsistencies in it that I want to point out before making the argument for maintaining the status quo. One, you said we need to do it so that China really believes that we're going to come to Taiwan's defense, because that's what real deterrence means. But then you later said it's already baked in that we would come to Taiwan's defense. And that's why they didn't react that strongly to what President Biden said. So there's a tension there. You also said, look, even Article 5 doesn't say we actually have to go to fight. We could do any number of things. Maybe we could send out a strongly worded statement. I think that's very dangerous and its own form of strategic ambiguity. If the way we're going to do this is say, yes, we will come to Taiwan's defense, but that could mean a lot of things. I think that could have the effect both of making things worse with China without actually achieving the deterrent effect you're looking for, and also watering down Article 5, because you'd be saying, does Article 5 even really mean all that much? So I think opening this can of worms is extremely dangerous. I would start on the affirmative case for keeping the policy where you, spoiler alert, anticipated I would. It's worked for decades. It's worked. And I do think it's worked because of this notion of dual deterrence, that it is sufficiently robust that China does, in fact, have a deep concern that the United States will come to Taiwan's defense. And I think that that is a major factor in their thinking about whether to take military action against Taiwan. But it also doesn't give any kind of green light or blank check to Taiwan to go do something crazy because they know the U.S. is going to have their back no matter what they do. And as you and I know, a spark for a war across the Taiwan Strait could come out of decisions from Taipei just as it could come out of decisions from Beijing. Now, you say that we could come up with a kind of complex formula about how we will come to their defense, but not if Taiwan does something ambiguous. So you're introducing another form of strategic ambiguity into that formula. I think we are better off where we are with something that both sides understand, which is the United States is prepared to come to Taiwan's defense, is postured to do so, that the chances of it happening are very strong, that even the president of the United States, when asked the direct question, says yes. That deters China. But that Taiwan doesn't get the full commitment that might lead them to take actions that would, in fact, undermine peace and stability across the strait. On Joe Biden, I think this is an important point. What he kind of proved with his statements is that strategic ambiguity is not a binary. It's not either you're fully ambiguous or you're fully clear. And in fact, your laydown was itself somewhere along a spectrum of sorts. And so in a way, I think our arguments are going to end up converging at a point, because I would say we can be a little less ambiguous while maintaining not going to strategic clarity. And in my view, that was the Biden formula. Get asked a hypothetical question, give an answer to the hypothetical question. Has your policy changed? No, it hasn't changed. Hard to square, but as we just went through, the entire one China policy is kind of hard to square. And yet everyone understands what is happening, and that helps produce peace and stability across the strait. I do think if President Biden had said, our policy has changed, we are going to defend Taiwan, China would have reacted very differently.
Much bigger reaction.
And that reaction would have been driven by the fact that they would have said, that's essentially a mutual defense treaty. You are essentially recognizing Taiwan. That is a radical act, and we are going to have to try to do something to vindicate our interests here. And I think that this is the kind of thing that is highly risky in terms of triggering the very war we are trying to prevent with our policy. And finally, strategic ambiguity could be kind of cast by a different word, which is strategic flexibility. I think our current policy gives us a lot of options to do a lot of things, not just if the big one happens, a massive amphibious invasion across the strait, but for other things that China may do. Try to take an outlying island, try to do a blockade, try to do a soft quarantine, whatever it may be. I think our policy gives us a range of options that a more formal defense commitment begins to feel a bit like it's boxing in a president in ways that are less flexible, both for things he may choose not to do or for things he may choose very much to do to come to Taiwan's defense. At the end of the day, the goal here has to be to prevent this war. Yep. This war should not happen. And so the question is not so much, how do you put yourself in a position to beat China in the war? It's rather, how do you ensure that we do not end up with a major war over Taiwan and that this issue gets resolved by peaceful means. I believe that the current approach, which has worked for decades, could bear some adjustments that give some more confidence to Taiwan and some more pushback to China, but should not be junked in favor of something that I think would put us in a much more risky position going forward.
Okay. I think you've convinced me. No, look, cards on the table. I think where I come down, not just based on this conversation, but based on, discussing this.
It was based on my
silver tongue. Your compelling argument is part of it. Is what some people call, I guess, a thicker version of strategic ambiguity, leaning in a bit more to the idea without crossing whatever that invisible threshold is. But I do think two things at least are worth watching. One is, one of the arguments that I think you made that's most compelling is this sense of who would be violating this sacred status quo, which has preserved, as you say, some degree at least of peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait for decades now, and how the world would perceive that. I do think if China continues to amp up military pressure on Taiwan in ways that just completely obliterate any semblance of their status quo on their side, that will raise, I think, real questions about whether current U.S. policy is adequate to the moment. And I think it is worth continuing to monitor.
By the way, that is a great point. China now doesn't take off the table the use of force, although it still has as a policy
to reunify with Taiwan.
Use of force to reunify with Taiwan, although it still has a policy, peaceful reunification.
Yep.
If China is changing its declaratory policy, moving more in the direction of, hey, we're going to go grab it, obviously that has huge implications on how we should respond to that. Or if we begin to see indications, as we did in the Russia-Ukraine context, that something was imminent, that should have implications as well in terms of what we then say in that context, in that moment, because then you're moving from a broader declaratory policy to dealing with a contingency and trying to shape it in a way that prevents the war that, would be so catastrophic to all of us. So I also would move along this spectrum. I think your phrase of thickening strategic ambiguity is a good one. And I think your best argument is that times have changed. China has become more aggressive. China has undermined a lot of the norms that have driven cross-strait relations. And so we should get, a bit more robust. But I think moving off of it to strategic clarity is not advisable.
So watch this space. Only the highest stakes, probably strategic issue in the world. And one, in preparing for this, one strange kind of historical linkage between the two topics we talked about, the Russia-Ukraine war and Taiwan, is that part of the theory of deterrence now on Taiwan is where we started this conversation, the sort of remilitarization of Japan. Part of the theory of deterrence of Russia, going beyond just its current conflict in Ukraine and possibly challenging NATO, is the remilitarization of Germany. Yep. I mean, two things that would be almost unthinkable if you were trying to explain them to anybody in the kind of immediate period after World War II. And now a lot of the world that wants stability and deterrence to be maintained is actually rooting for these two things, maybe to different degrees in the two regions, but a strange idiosyncrasy of the situation.
Okay, let's go to wrap.
Yep.
So first, anything you want to preview for coming attractions?
Yeah. So there was some news yesterday out of Congress that a piece of legislation called the GAIN Act, which stands for Guaranteeing Access and Innovation for National Artificial Intelligence, GAIN AI Act, is not going to be attached to the defense authorization bill, meaning it will not likely become law anytime in the immediate future. But I do think one space to watch as President Trump increasingly seems inclined, maybe then disinclined, maybe then re-inclined, to open and expand access for China to advanced U.S. technology, in particular chips used to train AI models in China, that Congress is going to try to step into this space and reimpose restrictions. There was a bill that dropped today along these lines. You and I have both been talking to members of Congress who are contemplating other pieces of legislation. So in the absence of a clear U.S. approach and in the presence of concern that Trump is going to open the floodgates, I think we should pay attention to whether Congress acts in this space probably early next year at the earliest.
would love the job of naming these bills.
Yeah, exactly.
Coming up with really cool acronyms and so forth. There's some good ones. GAIN AI is not bad, even though it seems to be DOA. That sounds good. And what about books?
So I am going to recommend a book this time. I've been doing articles up till now. Anytime anybody says they want to come and work in Washington in the national security world, or that they're starting a job in Washington in the national security world, want to better understand it, I recommend a book called Our Man by George Packer, which is sort of a biography of somebody that you worked relatively closely with, Richard Holbrooke, somebody I knew a bit. But it's really, to my mind at least, the best story about what this strange culture of national security Washington is all about. It's a cautionary tale in some ways. He was a complicated figure, made some enormous mistakes in his life, also somebody who had enormous accomplishments in the world that we have worked in for quite some time. And just George Packer is just a first-rate journalist, incredible writer. And it's a quick read for a book that is long and deep and substantive. So Our Man by George Packer.
So sometime in the next year, we have to do one segment on war stories about Richard Holbrooke. He was a one-of-a-kind diplomat. We don't really see people like him now. That book is really quite something. Okay, I'm going back to the beginning of this episode for the book I'm recommending, which is a book about the Wright brothers by David McCullough. Honestly, I mean, I know I was just down there. I saw it. You can actually physically go see where the plane took off and where each of the test flights landed. The first one, I think, only went 12 feet, but
shorter than the long jump.
They got a bit longer. Honestly, at a difficult time in our country for many different reasons, this story of these guys, this family, from the middle of the country, not formally trained, bike shop owners, basically beating the world to figure out how to do powered human flight. It's so cool and it's so American. So I would highly recommend that book. But I think that brings us to the end of this episode. Well, that's all for today. We'll be back next week with a new episode.
In the meantime, send us your questions and comments at longgame@voxmedia.com.